it is one of the central mysteries surrounding Donald Trump. What is in those tax returns and why is he hiding them? This week, House Democrats, they're turning up the heat, suing the Trump administration in federal court for 6 years of returns. In a moment, I'm going to talk to one of the few people who have actually seen some of Trump's returns, reporter Tim O'Brien. O'Brien says they reveal a lot. The new lawsuit accuses the Treasury Department of defying the 1924 law that states, quote, the secretary shall furnish the committee with any return or return information specified in such request. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin argues, though, the subpoena for Trump's taxes serves no, quote, legitimate legislative purpose. Watch this.
So do you think the American people have a right to know what's in those tax forms?
No, I don't.
Do you know what he's hiding? I mean, he doesn't want anybody to see him, certainly not Congress.
I don't think he's hiding anything, but...
Okay, so you don't know?
Correct, I don't know anything about his tax return.
All right.
And with me now, the man, the myth, the legend, Tim O'Brien, the man we've been waiting for, who's seen the taxes. His 2005 book, Trump Nation, drew a lawsuit from Trump over reporting that Trump was not a billionaire. That lawsuit was dismissed in court. Tim, good to see you.
Good to see you, yes.
So first, I want to talk about the terminology or how they lay this out, which is the secretary shall furnish the committee with any return or return information specified in such request. And the key word here is shall, i.e. must.
It must. This stems from the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s when the federal government decided it was time to keep an eye on the executive branch because of scandals around financial self-dealing in the Warren Harding administration. It dates back to that. And it is purely about congressional oversight of the executive branch. And it's well within not only the constitutional guidelines about the way that the Congress should act with regard to the executive branch, it's been instituted as some of the law that came out of the Teapot Dome scandal. So I think when Neil asks for this, he's well within his rights. Now, the argument he's actually made, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, is that they're trying to monitor, he's made a technical argument, they're monitoring the annual audit of the presidential tax returns, and they can only make sure that the IRS is doing that in a clear and clean way if they could access themselves to the tax returns. The argument the White House is making is that it's a fishing expedition, that the only reason Democrats are after this is to embarrass the president, and therefore there's no legitimate legislative purpose associated with it, so therefore no.
Okay, so you are one of the few people that has seen these tax returns. I know you're under court order not to reveal some of the details of what you've seen, but what can you tell us as to what's inside these returns? What is the president trying to hide?
Well, he clearly is trying to hide a number of things. I think, his business has never been as robust or as profitable, and the wealth that he's generated out of that business as he said it has. He's never been as generous a philanthropist as he has said he was. The tax returns would reveal those kinds of things. I think what's germane now for a President Trump, as opposed to a citizen Trump, is the tax returns would also show his sources of foreign income. And that gets to the issue of whether or not foreign entities from places like Russia, for example, or Saudi Arabia, for example, could have traction or a hold on the president's decision-making and policy-making apparatus because of financial relationships he has with them. Having said that, I also think the tax returns are going to have a fairly limited amount of information as well. It's not going to be...
Why?
Well, because Neil's only asked for 6 years. He's looking for a period 2013-ish, I think, to the present, 2012 to the present. I don't think those are the years that are going to be consequential if you want to understand all of the financial relationships that Trump had prior to becoming president and those that may be compromising. There's this very interesting period in the mid-2000s when a lot of cash came into the Trump organization that's never been very well explained. Those are the tax returns they need to get their hands on.
But there's no chance they would ever be able to get their hands on those types of tax returns from that time period, that they could justify wanting to get their hands on those tax returns unless they found a reason, a legislative reason to do so.
Well, it's been a tradition for the president to release.
Tradition.
It's a tradition. It's not a law.
Right.
And it's because the president is not subject to conflict of interest laws that other members of the federal government are. There's a constitutional read. The framers believed you would string the president too much if you did that. So the president has a lot of leeway. But every president prior to this has given years and years of tax returns. They could go back that far if they wanted. They just have to have the backbone to do it.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.